March 6, 1944. 27,000 feet above the German countryside. Hman Klaus Vber adjusted his oxygen mask and peered through the armoured glass of his Messerschmitt Bf 109 G6, watching the peculiar silhouettes climbing laboriously toward his formation through the crystalline morning air. The veteran ace of Jagdgeschwader 27 had 47 confirmed kills painted beneath his cockpit canopy, but what approached from below defied everything he understood about American fighter design. Achtung! More American escorts approaching from the southwest, Vber transmitted to his wingman, unable to suppress the contempt in his voice as he studied the ungainly machine struggling for altitude. Below them, 16 P-51 B Mustangs of the 354th Fighter Squadron climbed steadily in loose formation, their Packard-built Merlin engines straining against the thin air at maximum continuous power. To German eyes accustomed to the brutal efficiency of their own fighters, uneven American machines appeared fundamentally flawed. And the fuselage seemed too long, and the wings too delicate, and the entire aircraft stretching like a greyhound where German fighters compressed like bulldogs. Most insulting of all was the liquid cooling system, that vulnerable radiator scoop beneath the fuselage that would spray coolant and steam at the first cannon hit, leaving the pilot helpless thousands of feet above enemy territory. What Vber couldn't know, what none of the Luftwaffe pilots circling like predators above could have imagined, was that they were witnessing the arrival of the weapon that would systematically dismantle German air superiority over their own homeland. Within 8 months, these despised American fighters would be roaming freely over Berlin itself, their presence marking the complete collapse of everything the Third Reich had built in the skies above Germany. The story of how German mockery transformed into desperate fear begins not with aerial combat, but with a fundamental miscalculation about American industrial philosophy that would prove catastrophic for the fatherland. The transformation had begun 18 months earlier in the offices of North American Aviation in Inglewood, California. When the British Purchasing Commission approached company president James Kindleberger in April 1940 with an urgent request for fighter aircraft, they expected to purchase existing designs. America possessed adequate fighters, the Curtiss P-40 Warhawk and Bell P-39 Airacobra, but neither could match the performance of German Messerschmitts at high altitude, where bomber formations required protection. Kindleberger made a proposal that stunned British officials. Rather than license-produce inferior fighters, North American would design and build a completely new aircraft, incorporating lessons learned from the Battle of Britain. The British, desperate for any fighters capable of matching German performance, agreed to the impossible timeline. North American promised a prototype flying within 120 days of contract signature. The design team led by Edgar Schmude faced challenges that would have paralyzed conventional thinking. American aircraft engines available in 1940 lacked the high-altitude performance necessary for escort missions deep into German territory. The Allison V 1710, powerful at low altitude, gasped helplessly above 15,000 feet where German fighters excelled. British Rolls-Royce Merlin engines offered superior high-altitude performance, but Rolls-Royce production was fully committed to Spitfire and Hurricane fighters desperately needed for home defense. Schmude's solution demonstrated American industrial audacity. Packard Motor Company would license Merlin engines in produced Detroit, applying mass production techniques to British precision engineering. The Packard 1650 would incorporate improvements impossible in hand-built British engines while maintaining the supercharger characteristics that made the Merlin deadly at altitude. The first NA-73X prototype flew on October 26, 1940, exactly 102 days after contract signature. Test pilots discovered an aircraft that redefined what single-engine fighters could achieve. The laminar flow wing design generated less drag than any previous fighter. The carefully sculpted fuselage minimized air resistance. Most remarkably, the cooling system that German pilots would later mock as vulnerable actually contributed thrust through the Meredith effect, where heated coolant air exiting the radiator scoop provided forward propulsion. Performance figures emerging from flight testing shocked both American and British aviation authorities. The prototype achieved 382 miles per hour at 13,000 feet with the inadequate Allison engine. Calculations suggested that installation of the supercharged Merlin would push performance well beyond 400 miles per hour at high altitude, faster than any operational fighter in the world. Yet the British initially dismissed the design. RAF evaluation pilots condemned the Mustang as unsuitable for European combat, criticizing its high-altitude performance with the Allison engine and its unconventional handling characteristics. The rejection seemed to validate German assumptions about American fighter design philosophy. Americans built ground attack aircraft masquerading as fighters, machines optimized for the wrong mission. The Royal Air Force relegated early production Mustangs to Army Cooperation Command for low-altitude reconnaissance and ground attack missions over occupied Europe. RAF pilots flying these early variants discovered exceptional range and surprising effectiveness at treetop level, but high-altitude combat remained the domain of Spitfires. German intelligence reports noted the appearance of these new American fighters, but classified them as specialized ground attack aircraft of minimal threat to bomber formations. This dismissal would prove the first of many German miscalculations about American aviation development. While Luftwaffe commanders focused on the immediate tactical picture, American engineers were solving the strategic problem of deep penetration escort that would ultimately decide the air war over Europe. The breakthrough came through British recognition of American potential combined with desperate necessity. In late 1942, as daylight bombing campaigns suffered catastrophic losses to German fighters, RAF test pilot Ronald Harker flew a captured early production Mustang and immediately grasped its significance. The airframe possessed every quality needed for long-range escort, except high-altitude engine performance. Installation of the Merlin engine would create the escort fighter that Allied strategic bombing desperately required. Harker's recommendation launched the development program that would create the P-51B, the variant that Vber and his comrades now watched climbing toward them through German skies. The Packard-built Merlin transformed the Mustang from ground attack aircraft into the deadliest fighter of the war. With 1,380 horsepower driving the efficient airframe, the P-51B could achieve 440 miles per hour at 30,000 feet while carrying fuel for missions lasting over 8 hours. More significantly, the P-51B could escort bomber formations to any target in German-occupied Europe and return to bases in England. For the first time since the war began, American heavy bombers would penetrate German airspace protected by fighters capable of engaging Luftwaffe interceptors on equal or superior terms. The strategic implications were profound and immediate. German pilots encountering these new American escorts in early 1944 initially maintained their contemptuous attitude. The liquid cooling system remained vulnerable. The long fuselage suggested structural weakness. The wing loading seemed inadequate for tight maneuvering combat. Everything visible reinforced German prejudices about American fighter design. Major Gunther Rauhl, commanding officer of Jagdgeschwader 11 and one of Germany's highest-scoring aces, filed a combat report after his first encounter with P-51Bs over Brunswick in February 1944. The new American escort fighter appears fast in straight-line flight, but maintains the fundamental weaknesses of all liquid-cooled designs. Our tactics remain valid. Attack the cooling system and force immediate withdrawal. The pilot has no choice but to disengage when coolant pressure drops. This confidence would prove tragically misplaced. German pilots had spent 4 years developing tactics against aircraft with limited range and endurance. They could attack bomber formations knowing that escort fighters would eventually reach their fuel limits and turn back toward England, leaving the bombers vulnerable to concentrated assault. The arrival of fighters that could accompany bombers to Berlin and back shattered these tactical assumptions completely. The P-51 represented more than technological advancement. It embodied American industrial philosophy applied to aerial warfare, emphasizing range, reliability, and mass production over the artisanal perfection that characterized German aviation. Where German fighters achieved excellence through hand-fitted components and individual craftsmanship, American fighters achieved superiority through systematic engineering and unlimited production capacity. The mathematics of this transformation were already visible in production statistics that German intelligence either ignored or failed to comprehend. By March 1944, North American aviation plants in Inglewood and Dallas were producing over 400 P-51s monthly, a rate that exceeded total German fighter production across all manufacturers. Each Mustang required 25,000 individual parts manufactured to tolerances measured in thousandths of inches. Yet American workers assembled them with precision that matched hand-built German fighters while achieving production speeds that rendered German manufacturing obsolete. The strategic bombing campaign that resumed in February 1944 with renewed intensity would demonstrate the futility of German tactical thinking. Operation Argument, later known as Big Week, sent over 1,000 American heavy bombers deep into German territory, protected by swarms of P-51 escorts. For the first time, German fighter pilots found themselves outnumbered over their own homeland by enemies who possessed unlimited endurance and superior performance at every altitude. Hman Vber discovered this reality during the March 6th mission that would haunt his remaining formation days. His of 12 Messerschmitt Bf 109G6 intercepted a stream of B-17 flying fortresses approaching the Erkner Ball, bearing work southeast of Berlin. Standard Luftwaffe doctrine called for concentrated attacks against the bombers while avoiding prolonged engagement with escorts. Vber positioned his fighters for the classic assault from 12 o'clock high, diving through the escort screen to reach the vulnerable bombers. The P-51s responded with tactics that violated everything German pilots expected. Instead of forming defensive circles or attempting to stay close to the bombers, the Mustangs split into fighting pairs and pursued individual German fighters with relentless aggression. Vber found himself trapped in a turning fight with two P-51Bs that matched his every maneuver while maintaining perfect coordination through radio communication that functioned flawlessly at combat altitudes. The liquid cooling system that German pilots had mocked proved nearly invulnerable to machine gun fire. The Mustang's radiator, protected by armor plating and self-sealing systems, continued functioning despite multiple hits that would have disabled German fighters. More disturbing still was the American ammunition supply. Where German fighters carried enough ammunition for perhaps 30 seconds of sustained fire, the P-51s seemed capable of firing continuously throughout extended combat. Vber's wingman, Oberleutnant Hans Dortenmann, was shot down during the engagement after his Messerschmitt suffered cooling system failure from a single .50 caliber hit. Vber himself escaped only by diving away at maximum speed, abandoning the bomber formation to concentrate American firepower. His combat report, filed that evening, reflected growing German awareness that fundamental assumptions about air combat had become obsolete. The new American escorts demonstrate capabilities that exceed our intelligence estimates. They possess unlimited endurance, superior high-altitude performance, and firepower that renders our standard tactics ineffective. Most significantly, they actively seek combat rather than remaining defensive. Our pilots face enemies who can afford to engage in prolonged fighting while maintaining fuel reserves for return flights to England. March and April 1944 brought escalating losses that German fighter units could not sustain. The Luftwaffe was losing experienced pilots faster than training schools could replace them, while American escort strength grew with every mission. P-51 production reached its peak in spring 1944. With over 500 aircraft delivered monthly to units that were rapidly converting from short-range fighters to long-range escorts. The psychological impact on German pilots proved as devastating as the material losses. Veterans who had dominated European skies since 1940 found themselves hunted over their own territory by enemies who possessed every advantage. The casual confidence that had characterized Luftwaffe operations during the early war years evaporated under the sustained pressure of deep penetration missions, protected by fighters that German tactics could not counter. Major Johannes Steinhoff, commanding Jagdgeschwader 7 and one of Germany's most respected fighter leaders, documented the transformation in his unit's morale and effectiveness. His diary entries from April 1944 revealed the hopelessness that was spreading through German fighter squadrons as they faced an enemy with unlimited resources and superior equipment. "We are fighting an enemy that possesses everything we lack. Their fighters have range we cannot match, numbers we cannot counter, and replacement rates that make our losses meaningless to them, while every German pilot shot down represents irreplaceable experience. The Americans treat their aircraft as expendable tools while we guard ours like precious artifacts. They can afford to lose 3 fighters to destroy one of ours and consider it an acceptable exchange rate." The spring offensive that would culminate in D-Day demonstrated the complete reversal of air superiority over Western Europe. P-51 units began conducting fighter sweeps deep into German territory, seeking combat with Luftwaffe interceptors rather than simply protecting bombers. These missions, codenamed Ramrod, sent formations of 50 or more Mustangs roaming freely across German airspace, challenging the Luftwaffe to respond. German fighter units faced an impossible dilemma. If to meet these they rose challenges, they encountered overwhelming numbers of superior fighters operating over their own bases with adequate fuel for extended combat. If they remained on the ground, the American fighters attacked airfields, destroying aircraft and facilities with impunity. Either response resulted in unsustainable losses that accelerated the collapse of German air defenses. The efficiency of American fighter production enabled tactics that German industry could never support. Damaged P-51s were often abandoned rather than repaired, their pilots returning to England aboard rescue aircraft while replacement fighters arrived within days. German fighters required weeks of careful restoration for battle damage that American units considered total write-offs. This casual attitude toward equipment reflected industrial capacity that operated on scales German planners could not comprehend. By May 1944, P-51 formations were regularly appearing over Berlin itself, the symbolic heart of the Third Reich now vulnerable to fighters that had been dismissed as inadequate just months earlier. The psychological shock of seeing American aircraft over the capital city, while Luftwaffe fighters remained helplessly grounded for lack of fuel or experienced pilots, marked the effective end of German air power as a strategic force. The mockery that had characterized German attitudes toward American fighter design in early 1944 had transformed into desperate respect tinged with growing fear. The P-51 Mustang, initially scorned as another example of American engineering incompetence, had proven itself the most effective fighter aircraft of the war through the simple expedient of being designed for the mission that ultimately mattered most. The story of German contempt transforming into desperate recognition reveals a profound truth about warfare and industrial philosophy. The Luftwaffe's mockery of the P-51 Mustang stemmed from tactical thinking that prioritized immediate combat performance over strategic capability. German pilots saw liquid cooling systems and long fuselages as vulnerabilities because their experience was shaped by short-range interceptor missions over familiar territory. What they failed to comprehend was that American engineers had solved an entirely different problem. The P-51 wasn't designed to win individual dogfights over Germany, though it proved devastatingly effective at that mission. It was engineered to escort bombers to any target in occupied Europe and return safely to England, a capability that rendered German tactical superiority meaningless. By war's end, the sight of Mustang formations over Berlin had become routine, their presence marking the complete collapse of German air defenses. The fighters that German pilots had dismissed as ungainly American contraptions had achieved what no previous aircraft could accomplish. the systematic destruction of the Luftwaffe over its own homeland. The P-51 Mustang stands as perhaps the ultimate vindication of American industrial philosophy applied to warfare. German craftsmanship created beautiful, technically sophisticated fighters that dominated European skies until they encountered an enemy that had solved the deeper problem of projecting power across vast distances. In the end, strategic vision triumphed over tactical perfection, and German laughter died in the roar of Merlin engines over the ruins of the Reich.